What's up, investors? It's the Russian dude. Imagine being a Russian voter in the summer of 2026, with parliamentary elections only about 2 months away, sitting inside your car in scorching heat while waiting in a very long line for gasoline, occasionally hearing another drone alert, struggling to get mobile internet working, and then finally checking the news only to discover that one of the messages coming from Moscow is not about fixing any of these problems, but about how Russia apparently needs to capture Odessa. And this is not coming from some anonymous military blogger, because Andrei Kolesnik, a United Russia representative and a member of the State Duma Defense Committee, recently told Gazeta.ru, the Russian media website, that the Russian army would eventually have to capture Odessa and cut Ukraine off from the Black Sea, even though it's theoretically even impossible, which is still a remarkable promise considering that Odessa remains more than 200 kilometers away from the current front lines, and reaching it would first require overcoming the enormous obstacles represented by Kherson and Mykolaiv. Throughout this entire conflict, Russian forces have never seriously approached Odessa, with their closest major advance reaching the area around Kherson, before Russia eventually withdrew from the city, as we all know, in 2022. Odessa itself has more than 1 million residents, roughly 5 times more the population of Kupiansk, which Russia is struggling with. And underneath parts of it sits the enormous network of limestone mining tunnels known as the Odessa catacombs. Any serious attempt to take a city of this scale would therefore require extraordinary resources and manpower, which is why discussions around the idea quickly reach these absurd numbers, including the suggestions that Russia would somehow need an army approaching 3 million people just to overwhelm Ukrainian defenses around this area, and a huge number of FPV drones now operating across the battlefield. One unnamed Ukrainian prisoner of war supposedly summarized the situation very simply by saying that Russia brings truckload of manpower while Ukraine brings truckloads of FPV drones. This for that. And regardless of how literally you interpret that quote, it highlights the enormous gap between announcing Odessa as some future objective and explaining how exactly Russia would ever reach it. But for Putin, it's like, we need Odessa, that's it. But Odessa itself is not really the most important part of today's story, because Russian officials have made ambitious claims before. What makes this moment unusual is that the political system is making these promises right before the election, precisely when the consequences of the conflict are becoming harder for ordinary Russians to ignore, especially with the gathering problem of the biggest petroleum producing countries, all of which literally drags Russia back into the dark ages, thanks to Putin's unexplainable ridiculousness. One quick thing before we guys begin: if you ever wanted to support our work on YouTube, please consider checking out our Patreon. You will get an additional chapter at the end, and each episode is released in way early access. The link to our Patreon is down below. Thanks so much. Now let's begin. Governments usually approach elections by trying to convince voters that tomorrow will be easier than today. It's just straightforward and basic. While Russia's political establishment increasingly seems to be asking people to accept that tomorrow may actually become harder. That is this dragging back to the dark ages I'm referring to. Russian politics has a long history of officials producing comments that sound completely disconnected from ordinary life, with, for example, Boris Gromov, then governor of the Moscow region, famously suggesting in 2010 that people frustrated by traffic jams could simply buy a helicopter. Vladimir Putin himself had an equally memorable exchange in 2014 with a motorist who complained about paying a road tax of 4,000 rubles, even though his village, located 50 kilometers away from Federal Highway, barely had any functioning roads. Putin then jokingly asked why the man even needed a car in the first place if there was no roads, like he said.
У меня вот такой вопрос. Я автолюбитель. Плачу транспортный налог 4000. А дороги нет. И у нас вот от села до Бельго, до федеральной трассы 50 километров.
Зачем вам машина-то? Если нет дороги, зачем машина? Где вы ездите? Это провокация какая-то прям.
And where exactly he even planned to drive it. before the motorists explained that residents could not even properly transport even at least sick people to a hospital. Dmitry Medvedev then later created perhaps the most famous, at least inside Russia, example of this entire genre with the phrase remembered as "there is no money but hanging there." If you're Russian, you know what I mean. Those comments annoyed people and became even memes. But they happened during relatively quote-unquote stable period of time, when daily life was not simultaneously being disrupted by gasoline shortages, internet restrictions, drone alerts, airport closures, and military recruitment campaigns literally everywhere. Journalist Alexander Baunov recently described the atmosphere by saying that the air in Russia now feels different, and that phrase captures the political danger surprisingly well. Because dissatisfaction does not necessarily begin with dramatic demonstrations. Sometimes it starts when people who normally avoid politics begin complaining around the kitchen table, arguing online, or quietly deciding that they might vote against the ruling party. From the Kremlin's perspective, there is an obvious way to change that atmosphere, which would be to bring the conflict towards some kind of a conclusion. Create a sense, in that daily life might finally stabilize, and spend the weeks before the election talking about salaries, infrastructure, and prices, instead of another military objective hundreds of kilometers beyond the current front line. Putin clearly does not appear interested in that approach, but even if ending the conflict is completely off the table, the politically safer option would at least be to reduce the amount of military rhetoric and avoid constantly reminding voters that Moscow intends to continue indefinitely. Instead, guess what? Something almost opposite, completely the opposite happened. Because after spending months appearing relatively detached from the daily military narrative, Putin suddenly began emphasizing it once again. And that brings us to a much bigger problem than one united Russia deputy talking just about Odessa. Here is something I personally was not expecting at all, because until roughly May 2026, Putin often appeared strangely distant from the conflict that has defined Russia for more than the last 4 years. Almost as though he preferred to leave the daily battlefield messaging to other officials, while presenting himself as a leader concerned with economics, diplomacy, and the broader direction of the country. Politically, that distance kinda even made sense, let's be honest, because if something becomes increasingly unpopular, the easiest strategy for any leader is to, once again, separate himself from the consequences and allow subordinates to absorb the frustration. Voila. And Putin could theoretically have brought General Igor Konashenkov back into daily public view, allowed the defense ministry to handle the military updates, and personally focused on almost anything else. Instead, just as the consequences became more visible inside Russia, Putin rediscovered his enthusiasm and love for talking about the battlefield progress. Less than months ago, he complained about what he described as Russophobic and aggressive elements of the so-called collective West, while boasting that Russia was developing its economy, strengthening its financial system, improving its military-industrial complex, and moving forward militarily, presenting all of this as proof that Western pressure was failing. A statement like this would have sounded politically and completely routine a few years ago, but it lands differently in August 2026, when it reaches people who may have spent part of their day searching for gasoline or trying to at least work around another internet disruption. Because those people now have their own experience against which they can compare the conflict message appearing on television. The original discussion draws an interesting parallel with the old Soviet spy story, where one character explains that it is already spring 1945, rather than the fall of 1941, and therefore the time has come to begin talking to the West, because delaying negotiations has become dangerous, which is particularly ironic considering Putin's own background in the KGB. Yet, during a meeting with international news agencies in St. Petersburg, when Putin was asked whether Russia needed to hold the fighting before negotiations with Ukraine could even begin, he essentially replied that Russia did not need it. Ukraine did. Because Russian forces were advancing across the front lines everywhere and capturing new places daily. And that praise, "we don't need it," creates an obvious question because, voters may eventually wonder exactly who is included in Putin's definition of "we." Sergei Lavrov has also been reinforcing the same position for years, rejecting Donald Trump's suggestion in 2024 to freeze the conflict, again ruling out a freeze along the existing line of contact in 2025, while pointing to Russia's constitution and Moscow's claimed borders. And then repeating in the summer of 2026 that there would be no ceasefire even though negotiations could theoretically continue while military operations remain underway. From an election strategy perspective, Lavrov could simply avoid emphasizing this issue for a couple of months, because repeatedly explaining that Moscow rejects a freeze only reminds Russian voters that another option exists, and it is their government who is choosing not to pursue it. Yet the message remains that Russia is moving forward, stopping is unnecessary, and the population will simply have to tolerate whatever difficulties appear along the way. And Russian television has now started, well, explaining exactly what that tolerance is supposed to mean. When propaganda stops promising that living conditions will improve and instead explains why people should feel proud of enduring their decline, the political message has changed in a very important way. Margarita Simonyan, for example, recently responded to concerns about fuel shortages by reminding Russians about the early 1990s, explaining that people from her generation remembered food stamps and describing life in Krasnodar in 1992, when residents sometimes had to even carry buckets of milk, like these empty cans, to collect water from trucks. She emphasized that this was happening in central Krasnodar rather than some remote village in Siberia, before arriving at the conclusion that Russians survived conditions like those before, and therefore would need to survive today's difficulties as well. There is, however, a very strange contradiction here, because on the central argument supporting Putin for decades was that he rescued Russia from the instability and poverty associated with the 1990s. Yet now, one of the most recognizable defenders of his political system is effectively telling Russians that returning to hardship should not worry them, because they already know how to survive. Simonyan then also frequently invokes 1917, warning that foreign forces supposedly want Russians to overthrow their Tsar. Well, not even quote-unquote Tsar, but like real Tsar. And her answer appears to resolve around that patience, austerity, and accepting fewer comforts rather than questioning why these comforts are disappearing in the first place. Vladimir Solovyov then takes this argument even further by transforming shortages themselves into supposed evidence of national strength. Discussing the possibility that fuel problems might get worse, Solovyov argued that cutting Russians off from gasoline would not produce anger towards the government, but would instead increase the number of people volunteering for what he repeatedly calls the Strong Red Army. He cited strikes around Ust-Luga and St. Petersburg and described visiting an army training facility in the Leningrad region a couple of weeks later, where he says officials told him recruitment had reached absolutely all-time record levels, assuming you believe Solovyov, while also describing newcomers arriving from Karelia and other regions affected by the conflict. Solovyov mentioned a regiment commander by a man named Vasily, very unpopular name, I guess, whom he described as a tough and capable, while presenting records as people who had seen events reaching their own communities, and so they decided that they needed to defend their homelands. Individual records can obviously have very different motivations, but Solovyov takes those examples and turns them into a much broader political theory, where every new disruption supposedly strengthens support for that for the continuing of the conflict. And that creates a convenient circular argument in which military activity produces hardship, hardship supposedly produces more records, and those records then make it possible for the military activity to continue even longer, never-ending loop of Russian war. More importantly, it tells us something about the future currently being offered to Russian voters, because the promise is no longer that gasoline supplies were normalized or that disruptions will ever disappear. No, instead, hardship itself is presented as evidence that the population remains loyal and resilient. Somehow. The crucial question is whether ordinary Russians actually see things that way. I personally don't. And as expected, well, there are already many signs that show that many of them, as you would expect it, do not. This is where things take truly a fascinating turn, because the greatest political danger for the Kremlin may not come from people who have opposed Putin for years, but from citizens who spent most of their lives avoiding politics and are now becoming frustrated for completely practical reasons. One unusual example recently appeared at a concert in Yekaterinburg involving rock singer, Russian one, Gleb Viktorov, who suddenly launched into a political rant, unheard of in modern Russia, complained that authorities avoid using the word war, even though this is exactly what is going on, and instead rely on the official term special military operation. He then also claimed that Vladimir Solovyov, remember that guy, had been deliberately removed, shouted glory to Russia, called for a different government, and urged people to vote for the Communist Party. Let's go! His microphone was eventually cut off, and Viktorov became even angrier because his own sound engineers were stopping him from continuing, turning what began as a concert into a strangely revealing political moment, and very important to take into consideration. His claim about Zhirinovsky should obviously not be treated as a factual simply because he shouted it from the stage, but it's not really why the episode matters. The important part is that somebody with a public audience, at least small one, openly told people that the country was heading in the wrong direction, and then encouraged them to vote against the ruling party. For many years, the Kremlin benefited enormously from political indifference, because a person did not need to love United Russia as long as they believed politics had very little connection to their everyday life. Fuel shortages weaken that separation because someone does not need an ideology to become angry after spending hours waiting to fill a car. While internet disruptions annoy people who may never even watch opposition media, and then even airport closures affect families that have absolutely no interest in studying, military strategy. The political connection becomes stronger when recruitment advertisements and also statements about capturing Odessa, the one which, once again, this most recent one, appear alongside those inconveniences, like we don't have anything at home and now you want us to do what outside? Because the government itself is constantly reminding people why so much of daily life has become unpredictable. And that matters so much going into September, because Russian elections obviously do not operate like fully competitive Western elections, and United Russia retains enormous institutional advantages. But the ballot still gives people an opportunity to express dissatisfaction in at least their own very simple way. They do not have to become committed supporters of another party. They only have to decide that they want to vote against the people they associate with the current situation. And once that happens, among people who previously did not care about politics at all, the Kremlin faces a problem that censorship alone cannot ever completely solve. Now here is the most important part of today's video, because history is full of governments that appeared incredibly secure until people later looked back and wondered how the ruling class failed to notice that public attitudes were changing around them. Students read about Louis XVI and ask why the French monarchy did not understand what was happening, while Russians studying even Nicholas II, Mykolaiv II, can ask why the imperial government repeatedly increased frustration when basic political self-preservation should theoretically have pushed it towards compromise. Modern Russia is obviously not 18th century France or Imperial Russia, and predicting some dramatic repetition of either would make absolutely no sense, but at least the underlying question remains relevant until now, 200-300 years later. What happens when a political system becomes so insulated from ordinary life that its own instincts begin working against it? Since 2022, Russia has effectively been conducting an enormous political experiment, measuring just how much disruption the population will accept while being told that everything is proceeding successfully. The September 2026 election arrives at a sensitive point in that experiment, because even 2 months is now a long period, and nobody knows what the second half of August or September might even look like if the fuel problems continue, internet restrictions expand, airports face additional disruptions, and military alerts remain part of everyday life. Meanwhile, the official message is essentially the same: that the government will stay on Putin's existing course and continue, quote-unquote, advancing all over the place, all over the map. whether officials are discussing Odessa or much smaller places like Malta-Kmachka. Some people inside the system clearly appear to understand that this is not a particularly attractive campaign platform, which is why another part of the strategy involves removing political competition, accusing opponents of extremism, and preventing undesirable candidates from appearing on ballots. But the ballot cannot realistically contain the United Russia alone, which means voters who want to signal dissatisfaction will still have choices that are not directly associated with the current government. And ironically, every new speech promising to continue the same course may make that protest option even more attractive. This is also why I keep using the word system, because Andrei Kolesnik, Sergei Lavrov, Margarita Simonyan, Vladimir Solovyov, and United Russia are technically separate political actors. But modern Russian politics has spent more than 26 years becoming increasingly centered around one single person. Vladimir Putin first ran for president when many Russians who are now adults were still children. Millions of people have been born during the Putin's era. Many of them already had children themselves. And tens of thousands of Russians born under this political system have now been losing their lives in combat. For an entire generation, Putin has therefore existed almost like a permanent part of the landscape, something as familiar as the Voronezh River running through Voronezh or the Lena Pillars standing above eastern Siberia. But political permanence is always just partly an illusion. And what made Putin appear natural for so long was not only propaganda or government control, because millions of Russians also associated him with predictability and with the idea that tomorrow would probably, hopefully, look relatively similar to today. And that is exactly the part of the political bargain that now looks increasingly fragile, the one that it breaks will hurt Tsar the most. So guys, please let us know down below in the comments what you think about this entire situation and whether Russia's growing everyday problems can actually influence the September election or something more. And if you enjoyed this deeper look at what is happening inside Russia beyond the usual battlefield updates, please make sure to subscribe to our channel and like this video. Don't forget about Patreon, link is down below. Thanks so much for watching. See you on Wednesday.
We won't succumb to their tricks, the facade they try to sell. Their twisted words and feeble claims on us all they cannot quell. We see through their lies, their feeble attempts to sway. We do not believe